They say the forest is peaceful, the ocean calming, the snow-covered field serene. But that's only true when something isn't watching. When the wind stops, when the night holds its breath, and you suddenly realize you're not alone. It's not the howl that terrifies you. It's the quiet just before. These stories don't scream, they whisper. And once you hear them, you'll never walk into the wilderness the same way again.
Story 1. The Masked Man in the Snow. I don't remember the exact time, but it had to be close to 3 a.m. when something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a sudden realization, more like a slow unraveling that began the moment I stepped into that basement. The place belonged to a friend of my cousin's, someone I barely knew, and it looked like the kind of room that absorbed noise and hope in equal measure. The concrete walls were stained with damp patches. The ceiling hung low like it might cave under the weight of all the bad decisions made down there, and the old fluorescent lights flickered with a sickly hum, casting an off-white pallor over everything. The air had that heavy, sour stillness you find in places that haven't been properly aired out in years. We were a mixed group, most of us slumped in mismatched chairs or sagging couches, like the night had deflated our bones. Conversation had long died into disjointed mumbling. The six-pack was gone hours ago, and we'd moved on to some cheap liquor someone found in their backpack. I couldn't tell if I was drunk, exhausted, or some cursed combination of both, but my body was sinking while my thoughts clung to consciousness. That buzzing static from the dead speakers in the corner wasn't helping. It sounded like bees in my skull. My cousin mumbled something from the couch, maybe a joke or a warning, but it barely registered. My eyes felt like they had sandbags tied to the lids, and the longer I sat in that dim, flickering tomb of a basement, the more I felt like I was breathing in something wrong. Not mold, not booze, something intangible like a quiet wrongness that coated your lungs. I told myself I just needed air, that it was the alcohol mixing with sleep deprivation, but the truth felt deeper. Something in that room didn't want me there. It wasn't hostile exactly, more like a growing tension, a pressure behind the silence, like the space itself had started to hum with a warning frequency. I stood up too fast, tripping over someone's backpack, and mumbled something about heading out. No one objected. Maybe they felt it too, or maybe they'd already given up listening. The cold hit me like a slap the second I opened the basement door and stepped outside. The kind of slap that doesn't sting so much as it wakes you up from the inside out. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the zipper catching near my collarbone as I squinted into the eerie blue of the winter night. The snow stretched across the yard like a burial shroud, untouched and silent, glowing faintly beneath the pale light of the full moon. No cars, no people, no sound, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots, each step echoing louder than it had any right to. It was only about a 15-minute walk to my cousin's house, maybe less if I cut through the wooded lot at the edge of the neighborhood, a route I'd taken dozens of times in daylight, back when it looked friendly. But that night, with the wind skimming across the open field and the branches swaying like skeletal fingers, everything felt different. Like the world had paused, frozen not just by temperature, but by something older, deeper. I tried shaking off the unease, blamed the alcohol for making my nerves twitchy. "You're fine," I muttered under my breath, a weak attempt to drown out the rising tension threading through my chest. But the cold didn't just numb my face, it sharpened everything else. My senses stretched thin. Each distant creak, each flicker of moonlight off the snow's crusted surface, sent pricks of awareness crawling up my spine. I kept walking, the trees ahead drawing closer with every step. Their dark silhouettes stood motionless, but the shadows between them seemed to sway like something was moving just out of sight. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing but the trail of my own footprints, a dotted line through the field that suddenly felt too exposed, too visible. I had the sense that if someone else was out there, They'd see me long before I saw them. The wind shifted, carrying with it a strange hush, like even the night was holding its breath. I stopped, adjusting my bag, and stared into the tree line. There was no reason to hesitate, no real danger. Just snow and silence, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already started following me. I'd barely made it halfway across the clearing when I saw it, or rather, him, just off to my left, maybe 70 or 80 yards, out partially obscured by a crooked line of trees. At first I thought it was nothing, a trick of the moonlight playing with the shadows, but then the shape shifted ever so slightly, like a statue coming to life. Very tall figure, standing perfectly still, his form dressed in dark clothing that blended into the trees behind him. What stopped me cold was the face, or the absence of one. He was wearing a ski mask. That was no hiker, no friendly neighbor. No one out for a midnight stroll. My feet froze, my body stiff as if I'd walked into a wall of ice. I didn't move, neither did he. We just stood there, both caught in the stillness, watching each other across the snow. The distance between us felt both too far and far too close. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them boring into me like needles. There was something about his posture, his stillness. It wasn't casual. It was deliberate, calculated. I did what any nervous idiot might do when confronted with something they don't understand. I laughed, breathless and shaky, and gave him a little wave. Just a dumb reflex, like saying, "Oops," didn't mean to intrude. But he didn't respond. No nod, no movement. Just silence. I was beginning to feel like I'd wandered into some kind of unspoken standoff. My brain raced to rationalize it. Maybe he was lost, maybe a farmhand checking something, maybe just someone weird with bad social skills. But there were no farms out here. No reason to be standing still at this hour, in the cold, in the open. Wearing a mask, the wind picked up, tossing a swirl of snow between us. I blinked as it obscured him for a moment, and when the air cleared, he was still there. Unmoved, unchanged, watching. I didn't know if he was planning to say something, or if this was all he intended, to stare, to be seen, and to let that. Dread grow inside me. My skin crawled, my instincts screamed, that mask, that silence, that eerie patience. Whatever he was, he wasn't just passing through. He was waiting. Something in me snapped, not like a scream or a panic attack, more like a quiet click deep inside my chest. The sound of instinct finally overriding logic. Every inch of my skin buzzed with adrenaline as I slowly turned my head away from him, pretending like I hadn't seen anything. I didn't dare run, not yet. Running felt like a trigger. If I bolted, I knew he'd chase me. I just knew. It was something primal, the same sensation animals feel seconds before a predator strikes. So I walked, not casually, not too fast. Just enough to look like someone cold and drunk and eager to get home, not someone silently screaming on the inside. The field stretched out before me like a white stage, lit too brightly by the moon. Each step I took felt deafening, the crunch of snow beneath my boots announcing my position like a flare in the dark. I kept my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, my shoulders hunched as if shrinking would make me disappear, but I could feel him behind me. I never looked back. I couldn't. I pictured him lunging forward the second I turned my head, sprinting across the snow with unnatural speed. So I kept moving, every muscle taut, every nerve straining to pick up a sound, any sound of him giving chase. Nothing. Just the wind, the hollow beat of my heart and the mocking quiet of the night. Then finally a flicker of salvation, the weak glow of my cousin's back porch light, dim and distant through the haze of snow. I broke into a controlled jog, slipping once, catching myself, pushing harder. The porch looked like heaven, I reached the steps, took them two at a time, and nearly tore the screen door off its hinges as I yanked it open and dove inside. Slammed it shut, locked it, double-checked the bolt with shaking hands. Only then, only when I was inside, did I glance out the window. The field was empty, still, but the fear hadn't left. My pulse still thundered. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, because maybe he was still out there just beyond the light, watching from the trees, waiting for the next time I dared walk that path again. Story 2. The 3 a.m. knocks on the door. We found the place by accident. My friend and I were chasing a rumor, a half-forgotten forum post about an old trail and a hidden cabin deep in the forest. It sounded like one of those stories people tell to add mystique to their small-town camping trips, but something about it caught our attention. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the quiet thrill of going somewhere we weren't supposed to. Either way, we packed up, left the paved roads behind and drove for hours into the wilderness, chasing nothing but coordinates scribbled on a crumpled napkin. The deeper we went, the narrower the road became until the car could barely squeeze, through the tunnel of trees pressing in from both sides. The forest was dense, old, and disturbingly quiet, like even the birds didn't want to be heard. Eventually, the gravel path gave way to brush and roots, and we had no choice but to continue, on foot. For over 2 miles we hiked in near silence, our boots muffled by layers of fallen pine needles and damp earth. The air had that heavy, mossy smell of old wood and decay, and every so often we'd hear a distant creak, branches shifting or something heavier. Then we saw it, tucked into a clearing nearly camouflaged by time and neglect, stood the cabin. Small, weather-worn, barely upright. The roof sagged under a coat of green moss, and the windows were clouded with grime. The door hung slightly ajar, groaning as it swayed with the wind. For a moment, we just stood there, staring. It wasn't beautiful or cozy. It was something else, a presence. Like the woods had grown around it, not in protection but in warning. Inside it was bare bones. 2 wooden bunks, a cold fireplace and a warped kitchen counter with 2 dusty mugs, sitting like artifacts from some long-forgotten trip. My friend broke the silence with a forced laugh, tossing his bag on the floor like we hadn't just stumbled into a horror movie opening scene. I tried to join him in brushing off the unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin didn't want us there. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. Night fell like a curtain, sudden and complete. One moment, the trees outside were dark shapes swaying gently. The next, they were gone, swallowed by ink. My friend and I had eaten a quick meal over the portable stove, the warm canned food offering little comfort in the biting cold. Conversation had dwindled to scattered comments. Neither of us wanted to admit we were unnerved. The air in the cabin was still and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust lingered in the beams of our flashlight like old secrets. When we finally decided to turn in, we lit the single lantern and positioned it on the floor between the bunks. Its weak orange glow barely pushed back the gloom pressing in from the corners. The silence was unnatural, not just quiet, but total, like the world outside had gone mute. I lay there on my bunk with my eyes open, listening for something I couldn't name. Every groan of the wooden walls, every creak from the old roof beams above, felt amplified. And then came the knock, a single deliberate tap against the door. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so soft I wasn't sure I'd actually heard it. But my body reacted before my mind did. My breath caught in my throat, my muscles tensed, and I turned my head toward the entrance like prey spotting a predator. My friend had heard it too. I saw his eyes glint in the lantern light as he looked at me across the room, face pale and unmoving. We said nothing. We didn't have to. We were both thinking the same thing. It wasn't the wind. It came again. Knock, knock. Still soft. Still steady. No animal would knock like that. No branch would strike so rhythmically. This wasn't some random noise. It was intentional. It was human. Or something pretending to be. We stayed frozen. Every breath held. My heart pounded in. My chest, loud enough I was sure it could be heard through the walls. The knocking stopped after the second time, but that was worse. The silence that followed was pregnant with presence, like someone on the other side of the door was listening, waiting for us to move, waiting for us to answer. The knock didn't come again. That should have brought relief. Instead, it was like the air in the cabin thickened, turned syrupy, harder to breathe. The silence that followed wasn't just absence, it was aware, as if whatever had tapped on the door was still out there, just beyond the wooden frame, listening for us to stir. My friend and I exchanged glances, wide-eyed and wordless, our expressions reflecting the same thought. Something is wrong. Deeply, invisibly wrong. I strained to hear footsteps retreating. Nothing, no crunch of snow, no rustle of clothing or brush, just the fireless creaks of old timber groaning against the cold and the high whisper of wind pressing against the thin windows. I found myself clenching the edge of my bunk, every muscle coiled like a spring. The air was so still I could hear the ticking of my friend's wristwatch from across the room. He whispered finally, voice barely audible. "Should we check it?" I didn't respond. I couldn't, because some part of me, the primitive, instinctual part, knew that to open that door would be to cross some invisible line, to step into something we couldn't undo. So instead, we waited. Every second dragged like a minute. The light from the lantern dimmed as the fuel burned low, casting longer, twitchier shadows on the cabin walls. I swore I saw one move. Then, something scraped across the outside of the cabin. Not hard, not threatening, more like a brush. A deliberate drag like fingers or cloth or something rough being slowly drawn along the wooden siding. It circled, not quickly, not carelessly, measured, patient. That was what chilled me more than anything. The sense that whatever this was, it wasn't rushed. It could take its time. I mouthed a silent prayer without thinking. My friend gripped his flashlight, knuckles, white but didn't turn it on. Neither of us wanted to break the darkness any more than necessary. Eventually, after what felt like a year wrapped in seconds, the sounds stopped. No final knock, no scurry into the woods, just nothing. Silence so complete it rang in my ears, but the feeling didn't leave. That stayed with us, seeping into the walls and into our skin, like the cabin itself had inhaled and was still holding its breath. At first light, we moved like ghosts. Neither of us had truly slept, just lay there, still and strained, half hoping. The darkness would pass without another knock, half dreading it would. When the grey dawn finally bled through the grime-streaked window, I felt no relief, just a brittle sense of survival. Something primal had passed through the night, and now we were left to sift through the stillness for proof we hadn't imagined it. We stepped outside together. The cold bit harder in the daylight, as if the warmth from inside had tricked our bodies into a false sense of security. I scanned the perimeter of the cabin with my heart pounding behind my ribs, expecting to see something, anything, that could confirm the sounds, the knocking, the scraping. But there was nothing, no footprints in the snow, not a single mark leading to or from the door. The fresh white crust around the cabin was untouched, clean, perfect, as if no one had ever been there, as if we had dreamed it all, but we hadn't. I looked for scratches on the wood where we heard the dragging sound. Nothing obvious, no gouges, just faded paint and weather-worn grain. My friend circled to the other side, muttering to himself, crouching low like he might find a thread of truth hidden in the earth. We stood there for a long time, confused, and increasingly uneasy. It wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the impossibility of it. The cabin was remote, surrounded by thick forest, and the snowfall from the night before had been soft but steady. Anyone or anything that had walked up to our door would have left a trail. Even a squirrel would have left tracks, but there was only undisturbed snow, wind-swept and silent. We didn't say much as we packed our gear. The mood was heavy, and we both felt it. Something had visited us, and whatever it was, it had come and gone without leaving a single trace. That scared me more than if we'd found claw marks or boot prints. At least those would make it tangible, real. But this was absence with intent. And as we hiked back down the trail, casting glances over our shoulders every few minutes, we couldn't help but feel that the woods hadn't let us go. They had only stepped aside for now. Story 3. The Ghost Town and the Final Gunshot. We'd been on the road for what felt like hours. 2 friends and I, traveling the northern backroads of California, chasing solitude and starry skies. We'd spent nearly 3 months wandering, through forests and forgotten trails, sleeping beneath trees and cooking over campfires. But something about that final leg of our journey felt different, like we were driving into the mouth of something that had been waiting for us all along. The landscape changed gradually. Towering evergreens gave way to scraggly brush, then low hills that rolled under a pale, sinking sun. It was near dusk when we spotted the battered wooden sign, half swallowed by weeds at a fork in the road. The name was too faded to read, but it pointed left, and that was all we needed. We were tired, hungry, and more than ready to rest. The road narrowed into a cracked ribbon of asphalt as we drove deeper into what could barely be called a town. A single gas pump stood lopsided outside, a rusted shack. A shuttered post office squatted nearby, its windows dusty and dark. And then there was the bar, the only building that looked remotely alive, glowing weakly with a flickering neon sign that buzzed like an angry insect. It wasn't abandoned exactly, but it was forgotten. No cars passed us. No voices drifted out from any buildings. It was the kind of place that felt paused, like a movie set between takes. We exchanged glances in the car, the silence thick enough to muffle even our thoughts. One of my friends cracked a joke to cut the tension, but it landed flat. No one laughed. We didn't stay. Not really. Just passed through, following a rocky dirt path that branched off a few miles beyond the bar. We found a place to camp outside town, a small clearing ringed by dry bushes, the soil cracked and dusted with fine gravel. It wasn't ideal, but it was away from the weirdness. Or so we thought. As we pitched our tents and got a small fire going, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town hadn't let us go, that something or someone had noticed our arrival, had marked it, had filed it away, and that night it would come calling. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard the shouting. I'd been lying in my tent, eyes half-lidded, listening to the shallow breathing of my friends nearby. We were camped just outside that strange town, the fire long, since reduced to a pile of faintly glowing embers. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and pine sap. I hadn't fallen asleep, just hovered in that hazy space where dreams and thoughts blur together, when the silence cracked open. A voice tore through the darkness, sharp, angry, male. I jolted upright, heart thudding, the nylon of my sleeping bag crinkling beneath me. Another voice followed, this one louder, more frantic. It wasn't an argument, it was a brawl of words, jumbled and overlapping, with no sense of who was right or who was listening. It came from somewhere beyond the scrubby brush that bordered our camp, maybe down the dirt road, maybe closer. I unzipped my tent just an inch, peering out into the black. The moon had dipped behind a bank of clouds, casting everything in deep, shadow. I could barely make out the shapes of my friends' tents, but I saw movement. One of them had heard it too. My friend poked her head out, her face pale even in the dark, her mouth slightly open as if afraid to speak. 3 voices now, yelling, overlapping. One was slurred, almost panicked. Another sounded furious. And the third, its cadence was different. Colder, measured. Not yelling to be heard, but to deliver something. A warning, a threat. The shouting rose to a crescendo, and then a gunshot cracked through the night. We all froze. The sound was deafening in the stillness that followed, echoing off the hills, folding back into the trees. Then nothing. Not a breath, not a scuffle. Silence returned with brutal finality, like a lid snapping shut. No one dared speak. I pulled back into my tent slowly, as if movement might draw attention. The fire hissed quietly in the distance. My mind raced through possibilities: drunk hunters, a domestic fight, maybe even a gang dispute. But none of it fit. None of it explained the absence that followed, that sudden, suffocating void. Because if someone had been hurt, there should have been more noise, footsteps, panic, help. But there was nothing. Just the cold and the quiet. And that town, not far behind us, still watching. That single gunshot didn't just echo through the trees. It hung in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. My body had gone rigid, fingers clenched tight around the edge of my sleeping bag. My breath shallow and controlled, like I could make myself smaller. Across the clearing, my friends hadn't moved either. We were all suspended in the same moment, as if breaking the silence might summon something we weren't ready for. Time stretched. The minutes felt wrong, longer, heavier. I kept waiting for some kind of follow-up, a scream, running footsteps, maybe even another shot. But there was nothing, just silence. And not the gentle kind. This was the silence of something finished. Final. I pushed the flap of my tent open just enough to see outside. The embers in our fire pit had almost died completely, throwing long, lazy shadows that shifted as the wind passed. I could see my friend across from me doing the same, his eyes locked on mine through the gloom, both of us frozen in a silent conversation of fear. Do we go look? Do we run? Do we do nothing? I didn't even want to whisper the questions out loud. In the distance there was still no sound. The woods were deathly still. No crickets, no wind. Even the trees felt like they were holding their breath. And beyond, that the town lay somewhere behind us, dark, quiet, and absolutely unbothered. As if this was just another night. Eventually I lay back down, not because I felt safe, but because I didn't know what else to do. Sleep was out of the question. My eyes stayed open, locked on the fabric ceiling of my tent, while my ears strained. For the smallest noise, a shuffle, a cough, anything. But the quiet endured. It felt like we weren't supposed to be here. Not just in this clearing, but in that region, on that road, in that town, near those people. Like we'd stumbled into a place where stories ended without explanation, where some things happened in the dark and stayed there. That night, I learned a new kind of fear. Not fear of danger, but fear of the unknown that refuses to explain itself. The kind that stares back from the dark and never blinks. Morning came slowly, bleeding pale light into the corners of my tent like a reluctant confession. My limbs ached with exhaustion, not from physical strain, but from the constant tension of being awake and afraid. When I unzipped the flap, the clearing looked the same as it had the night before, dusty, barren, sun-streaked. But nothing felt the same. Something about the air was different, stagnant, too still. We didn't talk much as we broke camp. No jokes, no idle chatter, just the rhythmic shuffling of sleeping bags being stuffed into packs, the occasional clink of metal zippers. My friends looked as wrecked as I felt, shadows under their eyes, silence thick around their movements. We all kept glancing toward the direction the shouting had come from, but no one suggested going back. The idea hung there between us like smoke. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe someone was dead. Maybe someone was waiting. But we didn't move toward the voices. We moved away. We walked back toward the dusty road, our boots dragging more than stepping. My mind kept looping through everything I hadn't seen. The argument, the shot, the silence. I imagined a figure slumped in the dirt, or worse, standing in the trees watching us leave. We hadn't done anything, not really. And that's what gnawed at me most. The not doing. The silence. We returned to the forest, as if we hadn't heard a thing. We passed the edge of the town again, if you could call it that. The gas pump still stood like a rusted monument. The bar was dark now, no neon glow in the window. A battered pickup sat near the post office, but no one was inside. No movement, no eyes behind curtains, just the sensation of being watched and judged by a place that offered no answers and asked no questions. One of my friends asked half-heartedly if we should report it. To who? Another replied. We all knew the rumor. One sheriff, spread too thin, with loyalties not worth trusting. We were outsiders here. Our words wouldn't mean much, maybe worse, they might mean too much. So we left. But I carried that silence with me. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of action. We walked away from something real. Something wrong, and no one would ever know. That guilt didn't go away. It just found a place to sit and stayed. Story 4. The Gravedigger in the Forest. The sun was already tilting toward late afternoon when we pulled off the highway, tires crunching over old gravel and patches of brittle grass. The GPS had lost signal miles back, and our printed directions, ripped from some obscure online forum, weren't exactly confidence-inspiring, but we were committed. Somewhere beyond this turn, the forum had promised, was a hidden local trail with insane views and total isolation. At the time, those last two words felt like a selling point. The road we turned onto barely qualified as such. Just a thinning stretch of cracked asphalt, hemmed in tightly by crooked trees that leaned toward us as if eavesdropping. And then, just as the pavement gave way to dirt, we saw it, the sign. It was barely hanging from a rusted metal pole, more suggestion than structure. The wood was grey and warped, its letters chipped into unreadable scars. Moss had crept across its edges, like it was being slowly swallowed by time. I slowed the car, glancing at my friend in the passenger seat. He raised his eyebrows, then gave a half-hearted shrug. Looks about right. We rolled forward. The sound of our tires on gravel felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. The forest on either side grew denser with each bend in the road. The light, above thinning into long slashes of gold, filtered through heavy limbs. There was no signage, no trail markers, not even another car or sign of human life. Just that forgotten sign and a growing sense that we were following something we weren't meant to. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the road narrowing until branches scraped against both sides of the car. I kept one eye on the fuel gauge and the other on the deepening shadows. The silence was back, that same unnatural quiet we'd felt near the town. But this was worse. Out here, even the wind seemed reluctant to move. My friend reached over and turned off the radio. No signal, just static. "Still want that view?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He forced a laugh. "I mean, we're already in it." I didn't say it out loud, but I couldn't shake the thought. That sign wasn't just a marker. It was a warning, and we'd already passed it. We reached the clearing just as the last threads of daylight slipped behind the hills. The road had narrowed to the point of vanishing, and the trees closed in so tightly that it felt like the forest was trying to press us back out. But then, the dirt suddenly gave way to open ground, a patchy space of packed earth and gravel, surrounded by dense pine and bramble. It wasn't much, but it was the only place wide enough to turn the car around, so we parked and killed the engine. Silence dropped like a curtain. We stepped out, our boots sinking into the soft dirt as we scanned the tree line. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. My friend clicked on his flashlight and swept it in a slow arc, its narrow beam slicing through the encroaching dark. There was no sign of a trailhead, no carved marker, no worn footpath, just endless brush and trees that stared back like sentinels. We stood there for a few minutes, the flashlight beam bouncing across the tree trunks. The silence was so complete it began to feel oppressive. No birds, no crickets, just the faint hum of the cooling car engine and the whisper of our own breathing. Then I heard it, just for a moment. A breath. Soft, wet, close. It wasn't mine. And it wasn't his. It came from somewhere just beyond the flashlight's reach, where the bramble thickened and the trees leaned together like conspirators. I froze, trying to catch it again, but the sound was already gone. My friend must have heard it too. He'd stopped mid-scan, the flashlight motionless in his hand, pointed straight into the black. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just nodded once. Slow. We stood like that for too long, waiting for a shape to emerge, for some confirmation we weren't alone. But the dark gave nothing back. My skin felt prickly, like every hair on my body was trying to lift away from the noise I hadn't imagined. Whatever it was hadn't left. It was still there, behind the trees, watching, waiting, breathing. And for the first time that day, I didn't want to see the view. I just wanted to leave. We were already halfway back down the gravel path when we saw him. The headlights swept across the trees in long skeletal shadows as we crept forward, the car crawling over uneven ground. We hadn't spoken much since we'd left the clearing, just shared a few glances that said enough, we shouldn't have come here. My hands gripped the wheel harder than necessary. The forest around us felt warped now, darker somehow, like the trees were bending inward. And then, just as we rounded a bend in the road, the headlights caught something solid. A figure, standing, motionless on the shoulder just outside the tree line. I tapped the brakes, easing the car to a slow roll. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tattered coat that hung from him like wet canvas. His clothes were stained with dirt, the knees shredded, and his boots caked with something dark that looked too thick to be mud. But it was the shovel that froze me. The way he gripped it like a walking stick, one hand wrapped loosely around the worn wood handle, the metal head resting in the dirt. Not casually, not accidentally, like it belonged there. He didn't wave, didn't call out for help. He just stood there watching us approach. I felt my friend tense beside me. "Don't stop," he muttered. I didn't, but I didn't speed up either. As the car eased closer, the man leaned forward, just slightly, into the beam of our headlights. His face was weathered, sunken, dirt-streaked, his eyes catching the light like glass marbles, empty, reflective, cold, and that look. Not curiosity, not confusion, recognition, like he knew exactly who we were. The shovel shifted in his grip, not much, just enough to draw the eye, enough to make my heart kick hard in my chest. Every nerve screamed to keep going, but my limbs felt sluggish, like the forest had thickened the air into molasses. I pressed gently on the gas. The car rolled forward. As we passed, he didn't move, didn't flinch, only his head turned, following us, watching us disappear. I didn't look back. But in the mirror I saw him fading into the dark, the shovel still in hand. And I couldn't help but wonder, was he burying something, or waiting to dig something up? The moment we passed him, something in me snapped free, like a cord pulled. Too tight finally gave way. I pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward, tires crunching against loose gravel, the forest walls whipping by in shadowed blurs. I didn't say anything. Neither did my friend. The silence between us had thickened into something close to panic, something too heavy to speak through, but I felt it, the weight of his eyes. Still back there, still on us. Every instinct screamed to not look back, but I couldn't help it. I checked the rearview mirror. Once, quick. He hadn't moved from the spot, but his head, it was turned just enough to follow us. Neck slightly twisted, posture still ramrod straight as though he had become part of the landscape, fused to the dirt and dusk like some marker of the road itself. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. Just watched. I turned back to the road, jaw clenched tight, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The car hit a small rut, jolting us both, and for a split second I imagined we'd stall, that the engine would die, that we'd be left stranded in that place where the trees had stopped whispering and started listening. My friend spoke first, his voice thin and tight. What the hell was that? I didn't answer, because I didn't know, because saying anything would make it real, would solidify the man with the shovel as more than just an apparition. And he wasn't. He was real. He was flesh and breath and bone and intent. The road felt longer on the way out. Every bend looked unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward the car, trying to slow us down, like the woods themselves resented our escape. The headlights felt dimmer now, weaker, barely holding back the dark. When we finally broke out onto the main highway, my lungs let go all at once. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath the entire time. The relief was sharp and dizzying. We didn't stop. We didn't talk. We just kept driving until the trees were nothing more than a distant blur in the mirrors. And even then, I still felt him. Not the man, the stare, as if some part of that gaze had followed us out and never left. Story 5. The Screamer in the Midnight Dunes. The beach was darker than I'd ever seen it. No moon, no stars. Just a solid slab of black stretching in every direction, broken only by the dull orange glow of a distant town far down the coast. I stepped out of my truck and immediately felt the damp weight of the air, thick with salt and the lingering scent of rainfall. My boots squished faintly with each step, still wet from the earlier storm, and the sand felt heavy underfoot, packed, tight like clay. I was alone. I knew that, and yet it didn't comfort me. Normally, nights like this weren't so bad. Turtle patrols were a solitary job, but they brought with them a sense of purpose, of rhythm. Walk the beach, spot a nesting turtle, mark the site, record the data. Simple, peaceful even. But tonight felt wrong. The ocean wasn't roaring or singing. It was whispering, muffled, as if it too was trying not to make a sound. I flicked. On my flashlight, a small beam barely piercing the dense fog rolling in off the water. Each step forward echoed louder than it should have, the sound of shells and wet sand crunching underfoot, bouncing strangely against the dunes. Usually, I'd spot a few distant lights from other patrol volunteers or campers huddled near the E. Sure. But tonight there was no one. Just me and the waves hidden somewhere in the dark beyond. For a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just another shift. I walked the shoreline slowly, scanning for movement, for the telltale shuffle of a turtle rising from the sea. My eyes adjusted gradually, and I thought just for a second I saw something, a curved head breaking the water's surface. I paused, focused, waited, but it vanished. No ripple, no movement, just more darkness. Behind me, the dunes rustled. Faint sound barely audible over the hush of the tide, but enough to turn my head. The flashlight beam swung toward the dunes, but it met nothing. Only tall grass bent slightly by the wind. I stood still, breath held, listening. Another rustle. Closer this time. It could have been a fox, a raccoon, something small. But the sound it made was too deliberate, too slow, like something pacing just out of sight, testing the distance between us. I started to move again, slower now, each step deliberate, as I traced the edge of the surf. My flashlight cut across the sand in jittery arcs, its fading beam too weak to give any real comfort. Behind me, the dunes rose like frozen waves, dark and silent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't empty, that something was crouched up there, watching, listening. The rustling stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe whatever it was had wandered off. Then the voice came. At first I wasn't sure it was even a voice. It was distant, distorted by the wind, but it had a shape, a rawness, like someone yelling from deep inside a dream. It started as a garbled shout, rising and falling without rhythm, echoing faintly across the sand. My whole body froze. I turned toward the dunes, scanning the ridge where the grass met the sky, but saw nothing. Another shout, louder, closer. It wasn't words, it was sound drenched in confusion and rage. The kind of noise that doesn't ask for help. It demands attention. My mouth went dry. I dropped into a crouch behind a small rise in the sand, instinct overriding reason. I cut the flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything. I crouched there, heart hammering against my ribs, ears straining to separate wind from voice, breath from threat. Then came a third shout, ragged, furious, and unmistakably human. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was up there, and they weren't alone. I could hear movement, quick stumbling steps across loose sand, grass being crushed underfoot, and then silence again, heavy, hanging. I stayed low, one hand pressed to the ground for balance. I told myself it was just a drunk, maybe someone from town who'd wandered too far, yelling into the wind. But even as I tried to reason, my gut clenched with something colder. The randomness of it, the volatility, the sheer isolation. Whoever was yelling wasn't looking for help. They were looking for someone or something, and I was the only person out there. Didn't know if I should run, hide, or wait it out. All I knew was that the beach suddenly felt too wide, too empty, and not nearly empty enough. I stayed low for what felt like hours, crouched behind a ripple in the sand, barely breathing. The wind shifted again, carrying with it that strange scent, the sour edge of alcohol and sweat thick enough to make me flinch. I listened for footsteps, for any sign that the shouts had moved on. But there was only silence now, stretched thin and tense like a drawn bowstring. And then came the unmistakable sound. Soft crunches of sand, uneven and hesitant, moving in slow, deliberate steps down the dunes. They were following, not charging, not yelling anymore, just moving, carefully, like a predator testing its pace. Every nerve in my body lit up. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, to disappear into the dark. But where could I go? My truck was parked near the base of the dunes, the same direction the sound was coming from. The ocean was behind me, the tide too far out, and the beach too exposed. If I ran across open sand, whoever was out there would see me instantly. I had to be smarter than that. I turned and crept sideways, staying low, keeping the dunes between me and the steps. Each shift of my boots sent tiny cascades of shells sliding, and even those whispers felt too loud. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, fast, panicked, and deafening. I stopped every few steps, listening again. The steps were still there. Slower now, almost like they were mimicking me. I clamped my mouth shut, swallowed hard, and kept moving. My flashlight stayed off. Its weak flicker wouldn't help now, it would only give away my position. The dark had become my only ally. But even in the pitch black, I felt exposed, like I was walking across a stage, spotlit by a gaze I couldn't see but could feel burning against my skin. A whisper of sand shifted just behind me. I froze. No voice, no cough, no mistake. Someone was back there, matching me, shadowing me. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but something primal had taken over. Fight or flight twisted into something sharper. More focused. I wasn't just scared. I was hunted, and whoever was stalking me was enjoying the slow unraveling of my fear. I finally saw the faint outline of my truck, a shadowy mass against the deeper black of the dunes. Relief surged, but it was hollow. The closer I got, the more unease bled into the edges of my vision. Something was wrong. My flashlight stayed off, but the faint glow of a distant security light down the beach offered just enough visibility. That's when I saw him. A figure sprawled in the sand just a few feet from my driver's side door. At first glance, he looked unconscious, arms thrown out, one boot half off, legs twisted awkwardly like he'd collapsed mid-step. I froze behind. A low ridge crouched, breath-catching. My thoughts scrambled. Was this the guy? The one who'd been shouting? The one following me? Or was this something else entirely? I crept closer, inch by inch, hands shaking, my keys already gripped tight between my fingers. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to him in wet folds. A handful of beer cans were scattered around him like strange offerings. His mouth hung open, releasing occasional incoherent mutters, slurred fragments of language, garbled syllables that sounded more like breath than words. He didn't move, didn't stir when I stepped closer, didn't react when I skirted wide to avoid getting too close, but something about him felt off. He wasn't just drunk, he was drenched. His shirt clung like seaweed, and his face, though slack, wore an expression that teetered between stupor and something darker. His eyes fluttered beneath half-lowered lids, like someone caught in a bad dream. And those mutters, they weren't random. They repeated. A word, maybe a name, caught in a loop I couldn't understand. I didn't try to wake him. I didn't ask if he was okay. I just moved fast. The sand dragged at my boots as I fumbled with the keys. Every second felt like it stretched out too far. When I finally unlocked the door, I half expected him to leap up, to grab me, to scream. But he didn't. He remained motionless as the truck door creaked open. I slid into the seat, slammed it shut, locked it. Only then, headlights illuminating the dunes as I reversed, did I see him again, still lying there. Or maybe just waiting, because I wasn't sure anymore if he'd ever been asleep, or if he'd been listening all along. Story 6. The Hermit and the Invitation You Shouldn't Accept. I'd passed that cabin before, dozens of times over the years, tucked just off the trail in the middle of a long forested loop deep in Pennsylvania. It was one of those odd landmarks. Hikers swap stories about. No driveway, no signage, no reason to exist. Just there like it had been forgotten by time. Most days it looked empty, shuttered, sealed up with boards and silence. But one particular afternoon as I came around the bend on a solo hike, I saw smoke curling above the treetops. At first I thought it was a small fire. My pace slowed. A controlled burn. Campers. But as I crested the hill and the cabin came into full view, I stopped cold. There was a man standing on the porch. He was large, broad-shouldered and thick, with long arms hanging heavily at his sides. He wore a grimy t-shirt stained down the front and sagging jeans that clung damply to his legs. An old charcoal grill hissed beside him, smoke leaking from under its warped lid. The porch was littered with crushed beer cans, a few tipped over and rolling lazily in the breeze. He looked up as I approached, eyes sunken and unreadable under the shadow of a greasy ball cap. I hesitated, half a wave forming, half a turn, ready to retreat. He beat me to it. "No food here, buddy," he said, voice low and flat, not even looking me in the eye. Like I was just another thing passing through his space. I mumbled a polite "just hiking," gave a nod and moved on. But something in his tone, it wasn't annoyed. It was dismissive, possessive, like I had trespassed on something I didn't understand. As I continued down the trail, I felt his gaze press into my back, not curious, not welcoming, just steady, measuring. That night, back in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling. I played it off as a strange encounter with a strange man. People live off-grid all the time, right? But there was something in his expression, in the way he'd claimed that porch with such certainty, that clung to me. It wasn't just that he didn't want me there. It was that he didn't think I should have ever seen him at all. It was almost a year later when I saw him again. I'd brought my sister, my wife, and her best friend out on a multi-day hike through the same loop. I wanted to show them the best parts of the trail, the hidden streams, moss-covered ridges, the overlooks that made you forget how far from civilization you were. For 2 days we moved through the forest under open skies, our laughter bouncing off the trees, our gear light on our backs. And then, as we rounded a familiar bend late on the second afternoon, I caught the scent of smoke on the breeze. My chest tightened before I even saw the cabin. It was exactly as I remembered. Half-sunken porch, warped grill still stationed at E. The railing, empty cans scattered like dead leaves, and there he was again. The man. He looked almost unchanged, like the forest had preserved him in that exact moment. Still thick-bodied, still wrapped in stained, sagging clothes. His hat was different, but the eyes were the same, sunken, unreadable, set deep in a face that had forgotten how to smile. He glanced up as we approached, and I watched something flicker in his expression. A shift, not surprise, recognition. This time he raised a hand in something that could have passed for a wave, but there was a weird stiffness to it, an effort, as if he had to remember how to mimic friendliness. "Plenty of food if you want it," he called out. The words hit me like cold water. The tone was the same, gravelly, uninterested, but now wrapped in a kind of forced hospitality. The man who had told me to keep walking a year ago now wanted us to come closer. I forced a smile, shaking my head. "We've got our own supplies," I replied quickly, trying to keep it light. The girls offered polite nods, none of them catching the tension in my voice, but I did. And I saw it mirrored in the way his eyes scanned our group, slower now, more focused, especially on the women. Something about his stare wasn't passive. It lingered, calculated. And for the first time on the trail, I wished we had kept moving hours ago, because this wasn't just a second encounter. This was a door reopening, one that was never meant to be approached twice. The forest was different that night. We'd set up camp about a mile beyond the cabin, tucked between a shallow stream and a patch of dense underbrush. On the surface, it was perfect. Flat ground, clean water, far enough from the trail to feel private. But something about the darkness that fell over us felt heavier than usual. The kind that doesn't just obscure shapes, but swallows them. We ate quietly, talked less. My wife tried to lighten the mood, making jokes about soggy granola bars and our tired legs, but I wasn't listening. My eyes kept drifting toward the trees, expecting to see a shadow shift, or a figure lean from the brush. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was carrying the memory of that porch with me like old baggage. But that night, paranoia became prophecy. I was half asleep when I heard the sound, soft at first, like a foot brushing against loose soil. My eyes snapped open. The fire had died to embers. The forest was still, but there it was again. A shuffle, then a low, wet breath. I unzipped the tent inch by inch, holding my breath. Moonlight cut through the canopy in scattered beams. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a figure moved between the tents. He was stumbling, drunk maybe, but too quietly. a silhouette weaving through our camp, brushing against our gear, muttering to himself in an incoherent slur. I recognized the build before I registered the face, the heavy shoulders, the slow, shuffling gait. It was him. My blood ran cold. He bent down over one of our packs, rifling through it without care. A cooking pan clanged softly. I could hear my sister stirring inside her tent, confused. My wife's friend sat up, whispering something I couldn't make out. The man didn't notice or didn't care. I reached for the air horn we kept clipped near the entrance of the tent. My fingers trembled. I took one breath, leaned out, and pressed the button. The blast shattered. The stillness. A wild, piercing scream of sound. The man jerked upright, staggered back in surprise, eyes wide in the flashlight beams that flared from every direction. For a second I thought he might charge, but he turned, stumbled into the trees, and vanished. We were wide awake now, and no one was sleeping again. We didn't wait. The moment he disappeared into the trees, we were already tearing the camp apart. Flashlights jerked wildly, bouncing across tangled roots and sleeping bags half stuffed into packs. No one spoke above a whisper. Panic had replaced sleep, and instinct took over where plans failed. We weren't thinking clearly, just moving, grabbing, fleeing. Every second felt like a countdown we couldn't see the end of. Behind every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow, I imagined him waiting, crouched, watching. Somehow we got moving. The trail ahead was barely visible under the narrow beams of our lights. The forest felt alive in the worst way. Branches clawed. At our packs, roots seemed to rise out of the ground to trip us, and the wind whispered like it was trying to speak his name. We stayed close, shoulder to shoulder, flashlights trembling in our hands as we hiked faster than our feet were ready for. No one said it out loud, but we all knew the truth. He could be behind us, or ahead, or nowhere, and that was somehow worse. Every snap of a twig made us flinch. Every gust of wind became a whisper we couldn't understand. My wife stumbled, caught herself, eyes wide with the same dread I felt crawling under my skin. We were miles from anything. No ranger station, no signal, no one who would hear us scream. The night stretched on like a punishment, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like we weren't leaving the forest, but being swallowed by it. Eventually the trail widened slightly, and we saw it, our marker. A bent trail post, nearly overgrown, but unmistakable. We weren't far from the next junction. The faintest hint of dawn was bleeding into the sky, pale and cold, like the forest was reluctantly giving us back to the world. When we finally slowed down, none of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us was full of what we'd seen and what we'd almost seen. The forest behind us stayed still, empty. But that night had changed something. The trees would always be tall, the trail always winding, but freedom? That illusion had been broken, because now we understood. Sometimes the thing to fear in the wild isn't nature at all. It's the man who walks without a sound and watches without blinking. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.